Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and welcome to my symposium. I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. Today is a special episode because I have a guest here on the channel, and we will be talking about BDSM and religion, and also esotericism and magic. Our guest today is Dr. Alison Robertson. She is a research associate at the Open University. She has recently published a monograph based on her doctoral research exploring BDSM as a lived form of religion. She is interested in the places where the lines commonly drawn between categories such as religious and non-religious become blurred or ambiguous, and in how such blurring affects the way people look at the world. Her research interests, other than kink, include lived and personal religion, edge work, and self-inflicted or positive experiences of pain. As always, you will find the contact details and her book in the info box. And before we dive into the interview, I'd like to remind you that this project can only exist thanks to your support. So if you have the means and you want to support the free delivery of academic scholarship on topics such as magic, esotericism, and the occult here on YouTube, please consider sending a one-off PayPal donation, joining memberships, or my inner symposium on Patreon, where you will get access to our Discord server, monthly lectures, and lots of other perks depending on your chosen tier. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Robertson. Hello, Alison. Thank you for coming here on Angela's symposium.
You're very welcome. I wish I really had come there. I was in Naples with you, to be honest. much nicer than rainy Reading.
Yeah, that would be nice. Perhaps one day. For my audience, I actually met Alison in person at my very first academic conference at the University of Chester a few years ago. And I was in the first year of my PhD, and Alison was super nice, and and I also, of course, love her research. That's why I asked her to come over and be interviewed.
I'm not sure I've ever been called super nice before. Thank you. You're making me blush.
But yeah, I'm very fascinated by. I've always been, and I also read your PhD thesis because you research BDSM in relation to religion and religious studies, and I think that is quite valuable in that it allows us to better understand religion in general, and also, of course, BDSM and lived religions, because I think that lived religions don't get enough attention and enough research.
I would certainly agree with you on that, and I hope it does. I hope it helps shed some light on both sides of both aspects of things I researched. I suppose, it's two different areas that have a lot of crossovers, and it's not really appreciated. So,
yeah, absolutely. So the first question, of course, is what is BDSM for those who don't know? Okay. I would imagine that most people know, but it's better to...
As I mentioned to you earlier, I was having exactly this conversation with a friend of mine just a few days ago as to whether most people know or not. His experiences that most people do, my experiences that most people don't. So let's make sure we're all, on the same page with this. So BDSM is a compound acronym. And it doesn't have one absolutely definite set of things it stands for. It's most commonly given as standing for bondage, domination, submission, and masochism. But you could also put discipline under the D, you could put submission under the S. Some people make the M and S master and slave, so you get bondage and discipline, master and slave. It can stand for a lot of things. But it's basically talking about all the practices that come around using pain and power and relationship in an exploratory way, often sexual, not always sexual. So yeah, bondage, discipline, submission, and masochism would be the easiest way to encapsulate it.
And how, what kind of research did you conduct in terms of putting it in relation to religion?
It was an interesting process, really. So my field work was all in the form of conversational interviews, very much like this conversation, actually, in that I had a sort of set of core questions that I wanted to deal with, but they came up in the conversation as and when they came up. I didn't have a hard and fast, we're going to go through this in this way. I had a standard first question and a standard last question, and everything else sort of flowed around that. But it was an interesting process, because to get my ethical approval, the university, they didn't want me going to any kink places with my sort of university hat on. You know, it had to be neutral spaces, which was interesting because not everybody wanted to invite me into their homes for obvious reasons. And obviously I didn't want to invite people into my home because that would create power issues. So I had some interviews in some perhaps unexpected places for people talking about kink. I don't know, pubs and cafes. John Lewis Cafe, good place if you want a private conversation. And so I had these conversational interviews with people, and then I analysed the results that came out in a broadly interpretive, phenomenological, analytic kind of way. So I was looking at the things people said and how that came up in conversation. So I wasn't trying to pretend that I didn't bring anything to the conversation, because obviously I did. And I mentioned that because one of the things that was interesting to me is how I moved in the course of my research from going, well, my personal interest in this have nothing to do with it, I'm just interested in what other people say, to a sort of realization that I can't bracket that off, because a lot of the conversations, a lot of my participants wanted to talk to me about what I understood these experiences to be like, and where I was coming from with it. So it really was a co-constructed thing. It was a two-way conversation, and I felt like I had to acknowledge that in the research in the end. So there's an element of autoethnography as well in the final work, as it were, but that's not what I set out to do originally. It's not primarily autoethnographic, but it turned out that I couldn't cut that out altogether.
And why and how do you argue that BDSM is religion, not a religion? And also, if you can explain the difference between.
Well, I don't like saying it's a religion. I mean, you could, I suppose, but a religion carries all sorts of implications about dogma and structure and doctrine. And it very much buys into the world religions paradigm, which to me is an assumption that you stick a label on something and then everything that falls under that label fits certain essential criteria, and if it doesn't fit those criteria, you leave it out of the category altogether. And I think that's a problematic way to look at anything to do with human beings, actually, because I think you always get these blurry spaces where you go, well, I could put this in this category, and if I do, I learn these things, and that's interesting and valuable, but because you say this category is this, I can't put it in this category, and that means I'm leaving out relevant and important stuff. So getting rid of the A before religion seems like a really useful thing to me. Even if you are talking about a named world religion, actually, it's still religion, it's still broad, it's still ambiguous, it still has blurred edges, it still has people who put themselves within it that other people don't think they have the right to do that or they should do that, and people who leave themselves out of it that you could just as easily look at and go, well, I think you do go in there, actually. And I think we get far too hung up on policing the edges of categories at the expense of actually understanding what's going on in the concept we set out to study in the first place. So I think religion is far broader than categorizing it into these a religion things can tell us. And I think if we don't accept that, we miss out on some interesting stuff. So religion, to me, I don't have an essentialist view of religion. I don't have an absolute definition of religion. I think you can study anything that does any of the things that organized religion does as if it was religion, and I think you can learn interesting stuff that way. So I would call religion a process of living, and a process of meaning making, and a process of world making, and that's why I think lived religion is a really useful way to study it, because I think we're all engaged in making sense of the worlds that we find ourselves in. We're all constructing meaning and constructing personal stories and building worlds and relationships and tribes and communities. We're all doing that because that's part of what it means to be human. And just because the ways we have of doing that don't necessarily sit in a named religious tradition doesn't make them fundamentally a different thing to what those named traditions are doing. If that makes any sense at all.
Yes. And how do you relate BDSM to religion?
At the very simplest answer to that is that BDSM is a means not for everyone, but for a lot of people who do it, of creating that meaning, of creating that self-understanding, of building those worlds and creating those stories, and exploring reality and different kinds of reality, as well as yourself within those realities, which is, to my mind, that is a process of religioning. That's living religion. Whether you call it that or not, you're doing that thing.
And is it because of the idea that BDSM can brings you to altered state of consciousness?
Well, I mean, yes, but not entirely. So BDSM is understudied in any context. Psychology, religious studies, sociology, anthropology. There's a lot of work to be done on what it is, what it can be, what people use it for. I chose to do the work I did from a starting point of those altered states of consciousness as an area of interest that said, look, here's some really substantial overlap with religious practice. This bears further investigation. So that was my starting point. And they are the subspace experiences. They are significant. They are important for the people who have them. But one of the things that my research indicated quite strongly is that the things that characterize altered consciousness, so things like a change in the sense of time passing, a loss of awareness of the space around you, difficulty in forming sequential memories, that whole list of things, they're present in any successful BDSM scene, regardless of whether or not the participants would say, yes, I spaced during that scene. Even if they didn't space, they still achieved an altered state. So there's a complication there in the simplistic way of saying, oh, BDSM can create altered states for some people. Boom, it's a form of mysticism. It's not as simple as that. It can be a form of mysticism and it can create transcendence, but it's altering the reality that you find yourself in, even if it doesn't create transcendence. So for me, it became about more than those sort of peak altered states, if you like. It became more about exploring reality by creating a new reality. So for the time that the scene is in place, you've created another world, effectively, that is real while you're in it. And this is one of the things that I feel very strongly. People often talk about BDSM as role play, and I understand that. I understand why they call it that. But one thing I would say all my participants agreed on is when you're in the space, when you're doing it, you're not playing a role, it's not acting. When you're in that space, it's a real space, it's a real world. The power differential is real. Certainly any pain that's created in it is real, because what's the point? Otherwise, you're not pretending to beat somebody, you are beating somebody. And the fact that you're doing it consensually doesn't alter that experience in an objective way. So you're exploring realities in a really quite fundamental way that is different to the sort of mystical, I was in another realm, I left my body behind. It's more putting mind and body together more emphatically, perhaps, a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
One of the other interesting things that comes out around that, so pretty much, I mean, there isn't much, but pretty much all the work before my own on those peak altered consciousness states, those spacing states, assumes that it only happens to the bottom participant, the one who is being beaten or being tied up or whatever else is being done.
The submissive.
Yes, you could. That would commonly be called the submissive. I used bottom as a more general term because submission implies power exchange, which isn't necessarily there, but ignore that, doesn't matter. So yeah, the submissive partner, if that's clearer. So there's an assumption that they are the only ones who can alter their consciousness. And the term subspace is far better known even in the scene than any alternatives like top space or dom space. But that's because of a perception of what altered consciousness must be. Because if you talk to tops about their peak experiences, they do have an alteration in consciousness, but instead of losing themselves in the way that a sub might, they're becoming more aware of themselves. And so a couple of them spoke to me about things like you reach a state where you feel like you just think something's going to happen, and it happens, because everything is revolving around what you're doing, and you have such power over the space, and you have this pin sharp awareness of everything within your space. The tiniest thing within your space is visible to you, and you're conscious of it, and you know what it's doing. But anything outside of that space, you lose awareness of entirely. So it's still altered consciousness. It's just a different quality of altered consciousness, because you can't lose your sense of self and be responsible for someone else's well-being while you're hitting them, but you can lose the sense of other things. So I think one of the things that my work did, that I hope it did, was complicate and perhaps queered people's understanding of what it means to space in a scene, because it isn't one person drifting off into the ether while the other person gets left behind. It's absolutely not that.
And does this produce a change even outside of the play, like in
I think it can. I mean, I think one of the things that would mark for me the difference between BDSM as a religioning process and BDSM just because it's fun and you enjoy it is that sort of reflection afterwards, that what did this mean, what did I learn from this, what did I get from this, and that turning it over and perhaps producing long-lasting change with it. I certainly spoke to a lot of people who talked about knowing themselves better and understanding themselves better, about gaining confidence and strength from those experiences, and also about those experiences constructing relationship and creating bonds between people, because as I said, it's not a place where you go on your own. If someone puts me into subspace, then they are there with me, and they have to be, or it would be a terrifying experience. They are the only thing in the world for me at that point, and that really does create some intense emotional connections and some potentially quite powerful exchanges of energy, and certainly a lot of things to think about afterwards, because you haven't got any control over what you show someone else of yourself in that circumstance. They are seeing whatever there is of you that's there in that moment, so you're very vulnerable in a lot of ways, and of course that has a power to it and an implication to it as well.
So you said that in some cases BDSM is used for pleasure, and in other cases for religioning. So the difference then is to have the kind of self-reflection afterwards, or to intentionally.
I think that's one of the differences. I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I certainly didn't meet anybody who only used their BDSM for ritual or spiritual purposes and didn't have the pleasure aspect of it. I didn't meet anyone who made that separation, and I'm not aware in any of the literature, even the stuff that comes out from within the scene, I'm not aware of anyone who would make that absolute exception. I am aware of people who would do different things, so where they find their pleasure would be a different form of play than where they're doing their ritual stuff, perhaps. Well, certainly, but I didn't come across anyone who would only ever use BDSM for ritual purposes, and I think there's an interesting thing to explore there that I haven't explored yet, as to where the differences would be in that instance between someone who's only doing it because the ritual demands of their tradition, whatever it is, as Gardnerian Wicca, doesn't it, has a flagellation practice, and I wonder how many people are doing that purely because it is a religious requirement and not because they get any pleasure out of it. Perhaps getting pleasure out of it's a problem, I don't know, but I didn't meet any of those people. What I met were people who they got pleasure out of it and they enjoyed it, and that was part then of the religioning process. Because they enjoyed it and because it becomes fundamental, you start to build it into your identity, and I think people do this with anything that they really enjoy. So if you're a football fan, you start to build that into your identity, and that can become a source of religioning. That would be the classic example, I suppose. It doesn't have to, but it can. So I think for pretty much all of the people that I spoke to, the pleasure aspect of it, the enjoyment aspect of it was the first thing. And then they started to find it more and more important to them as a thing in its own right. So it wasn't just about the physical pleasure, it was that I'm getting something out of this that is beyond the physical pleasure, that's beyond any of the obvious enjoyments of it. I call that a gestalt in my work. And I think a lot of things become gestalt if you can take out all of the reasons why you do something. Well, I do it for this reason, and that leaves me with these, and then I'll take out this one, and I've still got these. I think you can break it down. You can take out every possible reason why you might do it, and if you've still got something left at the end, you're going, well, I know there's still another. That's not it. That's not the whole story. Then you start to be talking about religioning, because you start to talk about meaning making. And yeah, reflection is a part of that, absolutely. Reflection and self-development and self-exploration, pushing limits, just transgressing norms. I mean, that's a very powerful thing for some people. All that stuff.
Can you expand more on your use of Gestalt?
Probably. So when I started, the word I was using with my participants was meaningfulness. That's the conversations that we had originally. So the conversation would always come round to, why is this important to you? So I only had 2 criteria to be a participant in my research. You had to have done something in real life. So there is interesting work to be done on people who just play virtually or online, I think, but that's not where my interest was. I wanted people who had done something in real life and who considered their kink to be an important part of who they were. And so from that, we got into conversations about meaningfulness, and whether it was just sex would be the obvious one, because most work that's been done on BDSM presumes that it's fundamentally about sex. And there are problems with some work that's done that. There are also problems with the assumption. But it's one of the things I asked all of my participants: is this sex for you? Are they synonyms? And the answer was no for all of them. They aren't synonyms, although they are connected. So then we started to talk a bit more about what else they might be. And all of these other things started to come out. But what also came out was a sense, and a lot of them, and I find this fascinating, a lot of them apologized for this, was a sense that there's something about it that you can't pin down in words, that is more than the words, that is more than the obvious things. And this is part of who I am. This is fundamental to me. This is really important to me. I would suffer if you took it away from me. But what the loss is that I would suffer, I haven't really got a name for that for you. And I was having this conversation with one of my participants, and he actually brought up the word Gestalt in the context of that conversation, and we had a sort of subsidiary chat around why the choice of that word. And of course, what it literally means is something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And it was a bit of a eureka moment for me. It's like, yeah, that's what this is for me. What is my kink for me? It's a Gestalt. It's greater than any of the things that I put into it, because it's more than that. And the more reading I did around subcultures in general, which is something else that interests me, the more it seemed to me that that was what a lot of them were talking about too. That, you know, it's not just about the look and the camaraderie and the story, and that there's always this greater than the sum of its parts. It's emergent, like consciousness is emergent. And that was what made me use that term in the end, because it literally says what it is that I'm trying to pin down. And it also, so one of my supervisors wanted me to use transcendence far more than I actually do in my work. And my argument against that was, but transcendence has a very definite religious meaning for most people, and I was looking for something that doesn't have that, because I felt I was looking at something more fundamental than any of those things. So I think an organized religious community can be a Gestalt for you, but I don't think it has to be. So I'm talking about experiential aspects of religion and religioning, rather than doctrinal or observational or any of those other things. You can only know if something is a Gestalt by talking to the person who's doing it and seeing what it means to them. But I don't think that makes it a non-useful concept to use. I think most people have Gestalts of some kind in the various things that they do in their lives, and I think that's an interesting thing to look at in the context of religion and spirituality. I hope that made some vague sort of sense.
Yeah. I was just, it's a lot of very interesting information. So I'm kind of processing. I was thinking of how this concept could be applied to my research as well. That's what I was thinking of.
If you don't mind me saying so, when I was saying it, I was thinking about your goth aesthetic, which I share to a great extent, and the goth subculture. And I think for a lot of people, being a goth is a Gestalt, because, you know, the idea, and you can see it in, like, you know, corporate goth fashion advice, for example, how to be goth and fit in at the office. There's acres of that stuff out there, because being goth is still important enough that you want to have elements of it. I mean, obviously, you know, we're in a different kind of world, but it's still important enough to you that you want to have elements of it going into the office. Why is it that important to you? Is the Gestalt. So that was the example that occurred to me when we were talking, because I think for a lot of people who embrace the goth aesthetic as completely as you do, it is a Gestalt.
Yeah, it is for me. And when I try to give it up, I felt like I was not being myself. So it's like,
yeah, and it's,
you know, for some people it's something very superficial, but for other people it's integral to who you are in the world.
Yeah, I've recently started to get really interested in this, the importance of these visual signals of who you are. Because I was having a conversation with someone about fetishes specifically. So he has a foot fetish, which is very specific for him, involves toes with sheer nylon stockings over them in open-toed shoes. And my reaction to that is, good God, no, never. Open-toed shoes, yes, no problem. Stockings, yes, no problem. Together, no. I would rather shoot myself through the head. And he did not understand how I could have quite such a strong reaction against this. And it was exactly what you just said. It's like, but that would just not be me. It would not be me. I wouldn't feel like me. I would feel like I was an imposter somewhere pretending to be somebody else. It would feel awful. I had a kink experience once with a dom who wanted me to wear makeup. I don't wear makeup. I don't like the way it feels on my skin, and I don't feel like I look like me with makeup on. And I did do it for him in the end, and it was one of the very few scenes I've ever had that I couldn't turn into any kind of pleasure afterwards. It felt like being assaulted. It was horrible, because it wasn't me. And so it is, like you say, for some people it doesn't matter. It's just an aesthetic. It's just a look. But for other people, it's an expression of something else. It's far deeper than that. It's a Gestalt.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I really love that. And what about paganism? You know, you already mentioned the fact that in Gardnerian Wicca there is some component of whipping, which is included in the ritual. But have you come across anything with regards to specifically BDSM and paganism?
Yes.
Like, for instance, is there a prevalence of pagans within the BDSM community, and
yes.
is BDSM considered to be important in the pagan practice?
There's a lot around this that's fascinating. So I didn't ask for my participants to be practitioners of any religion in particular, or of any religion at all. But I asked them all, as part of my conversation with them, whether they did consider themselves either religious or spiritual, and if they did, whether they attached themselves to a tradition. And while the majority of them said they did not, of the ones that did, paganism was the majority. So of those who attached that kind of label to themselves, there were more pagans than anything else. And they were all using BDSM as part of their practice in different ways. But what I would also say is there were a lot of people, and I think the kink scene perhaps attracts them more than some other subcultural scenes. A lot of people who had issues with labels of any kind. And I've written a paper around the issue of labels. So everyone was able to tell me, for example, what their kink label would be if they had to give one. And almost everybody immediately qualified that by saying, but of course, I don't like labels, and it doesn't mean for me what it might mean for somebody else, and here's what it means for me, was a standard part of the conversation. And I think that expanded out beyond just their kink labels. I think it expanded to religious labels, other identity labels of all kinds. So again, I wasn't looking for people who blurred gender identities or blurred gender boundaries, for example, but I spoke to a number of them anyway. Likewise, ethnic identity and I was going to, no, not racial, it would be ethnic, it would be a better term. Those kind of tribal identities, where your roots are, how much they matter. So there were a lot of people challenging all those kind of labels. So I would say there were a number of people in there who, if you were going to objectively go, well, this is what a pagan is, who on this list of people does those things, I would say there were a fair number you could put in the pagan pot in that sense who didn't claim the label. So the sort of two tiers of it, if you like.
And how would they use BDSM in their pagan practice?
So the ones, going with the ones who explicitly identified as pagan and who used their BDSM in their practice. So they were an interesting mix of people. So one of them was, two of them would have described themselves as Wiccans or possibly eclectic Wiccans, or generally eclectic pagans, and one of them was very definitely a shaman within a Native American tradition, which is the Heyoka path. Sacred clowns. Had some very interesting stuff to tell me about that. I didn't know a great deal about it before that conversation, but so for them, he had a number of aspects to that. So he had done, for example, hook suspension rituals. So, you know, you have hooks in the muscles of your chest, usually, sometimes in your back, which he described as being his blood sacrifice for his tribe. And he talked about blessing artifacts for members of his tribe with his blood and his pain. And interestingly, he said that he's not a masochist at all. When he plays for pleasure, it wouldn't involve that kind of pain. And he had some very interesting things to say about the reactions you get from people who know that you've done hook suspensions when you tell them you're not into pain. And the difference that it being in a religious space made to that for him was very interesting. But he also talked about using his pleasurable kink, the stuff that he enjoyed. He also talked about using that in this sacred clowning way. So he talked about mixing up expectations and disrupting what people think is going to happen, and the potential for that kink has. So, you know, you can dress in a particular way that isn't expected for the role that you're playing within the BDSM scene that you are, and you can do things that aren't expected, and you can disrupt and confuse, and that as having spiritual potential. And he also talked, so he identified as a switch, so he would take both top and bottom roles, but he also spoke as, actually that they all did in differing degrees, of regardless of your personal preference within a scene, when you're using ritual or energy creating for a purpose, especially if you're working with deity, how you always have to be conscious of your own submission to something higher than you, even if you are dominant in the scene that you're playing. So some interesting stuff there around human power relations and human and other than human power relations, I suppose. And they all had something to say around that in differing degrees. And then one of them described themselves to me as a sacred prostitute priestess. So drawing on the Babylonian traditions of prostitutes in the temple. But they were an educator, so they saw their mission, or part of their mission in life, as being to educate people to understand their bodies better, to embrace the potential of their bodies further. And BDSM as being one of the ways in which they did that. So they absolutely equated BDSM and sexuality very strongly, but at the same time they also talked about rituals that they organised that didn't involve sex. So they told me, for example, about doing a sort of mass hunter-prey kind of ritual. So obviously the dom, the top person, would be the hunter and the bottom would be the prey. And what you then do with that obviously is going to vary a great deal between the different people who are playing. So the way they described it, they had 8 or 9 couples each acting out this role in different ways. And some of that would involve using the prey in a sexual way, and some of it wouldn't. But they were talking about the different power dynamic of prey predator as opposed to master slave, or whatever other power dynamics you would get in a BDSM scene. And they did play for pleasure, absolutely, but they said they were always very conscious of their spiritual path. So they didn't distinguish the two perhaps as clearly as the first one did. And then the other one who springs to mind was definitely Wiccan, described themselves as being in training to be Wiccan clergy, which they weren't in the UK. That would be an odd thing to be in the UK. Clergy very specifically refers to the church, to the Christian church, as I understand it in the UK. But I suspect they were talking more about, kind of prison chaplaincy and school and college chaplaincy and being a pagan within that sort of area is what I think they were talking about. But they also said some really interesting stuff around being the property of the deities that you choose to work with. And one of the things they kept on their altar was a collar that they would, and cuffs, I think, that they would specifically put on if they were going to be working with their deities, even if they weren't going to be being the submissive role in the ritual. They would still collar themselves because they were submissive to the deity that they were working with and relying on the deity that they're working with. So some very interesting stuff around all that, I think.
And have you encountered anything in your research with regards to using BDSM intentionally for magic or other esoteric purposes?
Yes. It's interesting because the literature that exists would, and certainly within the Gardnerian Wicca tradition of things, would associate it very much with sort of initiation. And I didn't really come across any of that. Far more about using it to raise energy for various magical purposes, also for therapeutic purposes and kind of cleansing or spiritual rebirth kind of purposes. Those are probably the most prevalent. I think it's interesting because I think the assumption is very much to do with sort of penance and purification and punishment. And I don't think there is a great deal of that in spiritual BDSM. I think there's some of it, and obviously you can use it for that. But I think that's quite a Christian ascetic association, if I can use that broad distinction. So I think if you think about ascetic practices, you can think of them as sort of world-denying, penitential, the flesh is evil and I must punish it. Or you can think of it as world-affirming, I want to put my body and mind together, I want to heal that split, I want to understand my place in the world. And I think most spiritual kink falls on that side of things. It's far more about healing splits and understanding where they've come from, and it's rebirth for sure, spiritual cleansing if you like, but not in a penitential sense, not in an I'm intrinsically sinful and I must deal with that way. More in a I have to go past this, I have to go through this to get to the next thing. You can also therapeutically, and there is some work within psychology on this, but I think it overlaps with the spiritual, is people using it to reframe trauma. So people reenacting actual real world trauma, like rape, for example, in an attempt to try and reframe that and come out on the more powerful side of that equation, or to reclaim their body after what happened to it. And there's some literature around that and some experiences around that from a couple of people that I spoke to, which is, again, it's an intentional, it's an I'm going to raise energy to do this and I'm going to use it in this way afterwards. So I think there's a lot of intention. What I didn't find is people starting from the I want to do magic, how can I raise energy? I know, I'll get someone to beat me. it was the other way around. So it was, I'm doing BDSM, I'm doing kink, and I've felt these amazing things, and I've realised I can use them in my spiritual practice. So what I found was it all started with the kink and developed out of there, rather than starting with the magic and developing into the kink, if that makes sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I wonder if we have such an absolute connection in our society, and I've written a paper on this, co-wrote a paper on this with Wildcroft. We have such an absolute connection between pain and negativity, and the idea that you can get positives out of pain, and indeed out of any of the other things, because of course BDSM doesn't have to involve pain. It can involve various emotional scenes. It can involve humiliation. It can involve service. It can involve all sorts of things. But generally speaking, they are things that as a society, we go, oh, that's not a nice thing and you should avoid that thing. And I wonder if perhaps that prevents you from identifying it as a spiritual tool unless you already know that the reality is other than social expectations say it is. So if you already know that the line between pleasure and pain isn't absolute, and there are various ways of getting pleasure out of pain, if you already know that and you're looking for a way to raise powerful energy, you might be more likely to put those two things together than if you're looking for a way to raise powerful energy but all your experiences of pain are negative and unpleasant. I don't know, that's not something I've investigated specifically, but I wonder if there's an element of that in it.
Yeah, that's true. We tend to think of pain as something that is inherently negative, but pain is something inherent to life. So it is an integral part of life, and similar to, both pleasure and pain are part of our life and our experience.
And we also, we think we know what it is. I mean, we talk about it like it's very obvious what's pain and what isn't. And one of the things that kink experience certainly has taught me, I mean other things as well, but kink experience specifically has taught me, is there are some things that I can't put on either side of that binary. I can't tell you if it's pleasure or pain. It could be either, it could be both. It's something, or it's something else entirely. So I think it helps. And one of the reasons why kink is helpful for magical thinking, I think, is that it helps you move away from some of these absolute binaries. Like that, there's pleasure and there's pain and there's no space in between. Well, actually, there is, and I've experienced it, and that, I think that has to be useful for magical thinking, doesn't it? Because you're starting to deal with things that don't make sense in the objective binary thinking kind of way. So it's useful to have experiences that don't fit into those categories as well, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good point, because in Magick there is a component of going beyond certain binaries and going beyond certain boundaries and going beyond the usual, the common understanding and experience of reality.
Yeah, you have to be able to let go of certain things, don't you? Because if you hold on to them too tightly, then you're automatically ensuring that whatever magic it is you're trying to do won't work, because you're holding on to something that will stop it. And I think kink is good for that. I think it encourages you not to invest too strongly in those binaries, because one of the things it's about is about playing with them and exploring them and seeing how much truth there actually is in them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm gonna ask you a few questions from my patrons. I was really absorbed by the conversation. Yeah, there are lots of things to think about, definitely.
We can do a follow-up.
Yes. And also hopefully we will meet in person at some point.
Well, hopefully. We'll be allowed out of the house again at some point.
Yeah. So the first question is from Edward Iglesias, who asks, is there a perceived goal in a BDSM magical context? And then he says that there are initiatory elements that are found in many esoteric traditions, such as trials, set and setting, ritual performance, and so on. But in all traditions, he knows there is intention on the part of the seeker submissive to progress down a path to gain knowledge or gnosis. Yeah, so I guess that he's asking whether there is an intentional component.
Yeah, this is interesting, and I think I've touched on it a little already. I don't think you could do kink of the kind my research participants were talking about by accident. So everyone I spoke to was doing more than tying their partner to the bed with silk scarves as foreplay. So there has to be an intentional aspect to the kink. And for those who are using it in a magical context, they sort of have a twofold intention. But one of the things I found really interesting, so the shaman that I spoke about earlier, he talked quite a lot about accidentally creating magical spaces with his long-term partner because they're so in tune with each other and their energy resonates on such a similar level, and because they do magical working together, he says sometimes they can be playing just because it's fun and they want to, and they'll feel the energy building. So they had the intention to do the BDSM, they had the intention to play, but they didn't have the intention to do magic. And I think he said, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said now, I think he said something about having developed a practice whereby they offer that energy, they just offer that energy back to the universe and let it go, rather than trying to do anything else with it, because they haven't created it with an intention of doing anything, it's just what's happened between them. And I also, and this is something else people like to apologise a lot for saying, and a lot of people talk to me about building up energy and exchanging energy and creating energy, and then going, oh, I'm sorry, obviously it's not energy, I'm a scientist and I know it's not really energy, but I don't know how else to put it. So I think, within a tradition, you have to have a degree of intention, don't you? And there's a degree of responsibility about dealing with what you've created, if indeed you have created something. But I think the potentials of a lot of kink practices are such that I think you can find that potential by accident. I think you can create that kind of energy without necessarily intending to create it. And I think it's telling that a number of people who didn't consider themselves to be religious or spiritual at all, nevertheless described to me the creation of energy of that kind of energy through their play. So I don't think you have to have intention. I think you have to have intention to play. I don't think you have to have intention to do spiritual things or magical things. I think you can create that space by accident.
Intentionality and accidents. I think there's something really interesting there, in that we have an assumption, and again, I think possibly a social cultural assumption, that things don't happen if you don't mean them to, or things that happen by accident aren't worth anything, perhaps. And it's built into a lot of religious paths as well. I mean, I'm thinking about Islam, where you have to have intention for prayer, and you have to have intention to go on Hajj and intention to fast, and it's built in as this fundamental thing. But I think a lot of human history and a lot of human discovery is about serendipity, and it's about accident and seizing on that accident and building it. You find it a lot in conversation about art. If you read the kind of stuff that says, so you don't think you're artistic? Of course you are. And it will say things like, there are no mistakes, just see what happens and see what you can do with what happens. Somehow we only talk about it in the context of art. I don't really know why that is. So I wonder if discovering the kind of practices that will enable you to raise energy, or that will enable you to feel like your mind and body are more closely aligned than perhaps you felt otherwise, discovering those kind of practices, why shouldn't you discover them by accident and then use them because you've discovered them by accident? I don't think they're only worth it if you had the intention to do it. I think the accidental discovery can be a valuable thing.
Yeah,
and I definitely want to think about that more.
I think that in the realm of magic, magic practicing traditions, there's a lot of importance given to intentionality, which makes sense, obviously, but perhaps even the unintentional acts can bear a certain value, even from a magical point of view.
And again, from the magical point of view, you have to wonder, perhaps it's tapping into an unconscious intentionality. If you're, creating something that you needed that you didn't necessarily know that you needed, that doesn't mean you didn't need it. I remember, in fact, it might even have been at that conference that we met. I remember doing some yoga with Theo, who I mentioned earlier. And we were very simple. It didn't look like yoga at all, but it was about connecting breath with body movements. I have arthritis type pain in my hands. It's fibromyalgia, really. It's not arthritis. It feels like arthritis. And we'd done some of these exercises, and about half an hour later, I suddenly had this revelation. I just like a slap in the face. Like, my God, my hands don't hurt. They don't hurt. And she said to me, well, you should try and do some stuff every morning, just see what happens, see what your body wants. And the next morning I got up and I did some yoga, just a little bit of yoga, and had this absolutely overwhelming, I'm going to call it grief. I don't know what else to call it. Overwhelming flood of emotion. I ended up crying in a heap on the floor for about half an hour after this. And I went there and I said, okay, so I did this and it felt good. And then suddenly I was just this weeping mess on the floor. And she said, yeah, well, obviously, she said, your body's going, thank God she's finally listening to me. And that really made sense to me, because it seems like a lot of the pain that I was just putting up with and dialing down and ignoring is my body trying to tell me something that I hadn't registered it was trying to tell me. And then by deciding to do the yoga, my intention was just to see, all right, I'll see if this is going to help the aches. But the effect was that whatever parts of my body are going, I say do something, went, at last. So I didn't have the intention to create the effect that I created, but that doesn't mean the effect wasn't powerful and right and appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that, the same can be true of magic. I think you could probably do quite a lot of magic accidentally, actually. Perhaps it's less obvious in some cases than it would be with a kink scene. But yeah, intention's important, isn't it? Because you don't want to do any damage because you didn't know what you were doing. But I think you can do it by accident.
Then I have another question from Andrew.
Okay.
He is asking, non-cis-normative sexual behavior, for instance, fetishism, tends to be pathologized even after legal restraints have been expunged, with removal from the DSM occurring only very recently. Is this the case with BDSM? And has this helped or hindered interested people within the community in adopting paganism and or magical practice? Andrew is from New Zealand, by the way, so in that sense.
So, the simple answer is yes, absolutely, it is still pathologized. It's not unequivocally removed from the DSM, which is, if anyone is unaware, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used by psychiatrists to diagnose mental illness and disorders. It's the most used one, it's the best known one, it's not the only one. So the latest iteration of that, it did remove fetishes, it did remove paraphilias in general, but what it didn't remove was sadism and masochism. You can still be diagnosed with a disorder for either of those. It put in the proviso that it has to cause you distress, which was a compromise between taking out entirely and leaving it in as it was. So I would have to go to a psychiatrist and be distressed at my own masochism to be diagnosed with that particular disorder, but it is still present on the DSM. And that is a source of some anger in the kink community because of this link that Andrew has picked up on between BDSM, all kinds of BDSM, and pathology. And yeah, it's still really prevalent. It's popular culture is full of it. So, you count up the number of things that have your crazed serial killer interested in kink in one kind or another, and it's most of them. And And that's not it's not necessarily true that all serial killers are into kink, and B, it's certainly not true that all kinky people are serial killers, or there'd be a lot more dead people in the world. So it is a very strong connection, very strong, and it certainly affected and continues to affect how willing people within the scene are to talk to researchers about what they do, and how they do it. And from what I've come across in this area, I would say it does interact with pagans finding kink as a tool, finding it useful as a tool. I think even within Gardnerian Wicca, I think sort of discussion about what that involves and why it might work and where that comes from is quite often sort of glossed over quite a lot. It's sort of mentioned in passing, you know, these crazy witches, they do this, and then you move on. And I think that's true about a lot of things to do with kink. Some crazy people do this and we don't want to talk about it, which I think comes from the pathologization of it, and specifically the connection of it with particularly unpleasant forms of crime and violence against unwilling participants. So yeah, I do think it's a problem. I do. Although I say it's a problem, I mean, some kinky people enjoy being part of a transgressive subculture and don't really want to normalize it. And also you can argue there are risks in over-normalizing it, in that some of the more extreme things, like hook suspensions, for example, you really shouldn't be trying if you don't know what you're doing, or you don't have access to someone who really knows what they're doing. And if you over-normalize things, then perhaps you risk people trying things they shouldn't be trying. There's always circles you can go around with these things, aren't there? But I think the balance is the wrong way at the moment. I think the assumption that there must be something wrong with you if you enjoy BDSM is perhaps not as strong as it was 20 years ago, but still probably stronger than it should be.
I agree. Then we have one last question from Marcus, who asks, is there a relationship between the transmutation of physical pain into ecstasy in subspace and the transmutation of emotional pain into serenity in various spiritual traditions? For instance, samadhi, spiritual alchemy, and so on.
I mean, yeah, there's absolutely a parallel. And so, I mean, I had 2 or 3 participants describing spacing to me in exactly those terms, actually, Buddhist terms usually. But exactly that, this idea of transcending something, of achieving a peak state like samadhi. But I also think, I think you have to be careful, as indeed you do if you're just studying it in the context of Buddhism or Hinduism. You have to be careful about oversimplifying that. So subspace, well, again, it would depend who you ask. For me, subspace isn't about transmuting pain. There is no pain in subspace. The pain comes before, possibly, but then again, perhaps it doesn't, because what pain is and isn't is going to vary a great deal between people. So there are things that would look painful to an observer that I would experience as pleasure, directly as pleasure, as in I don't categorize it as pain. I go, no, this is a nice sensation. And there are other things that I would categorize as pain, but I like the pain. And then there are other things that are absolutely pain, and I'm turning the pain into something else and doing something with the pain. So any of those things are possible, and any of those things can take you to subspace. But none of those words have any meaning once you are in subspace. And I think for me, that's where the parallel with a state like samadhi comes in, is it's that state beyond words. Once you're there, none of the words you might use to describe other states apply, because it's different, because it's so different. And that's why you give it this shorthand name. That's why you would call it subspace. But for other people, I've certainly had people describe subspace to me in exactly those terms, as the transcendence of pain into ecstasy. And that works for them, perhaps. One of the things that makes it unique for me, though, and where I'm not aware of any parallels in established religious traditions, is in a BDSM context. In the BDSM context that I researched, because I didn't talk to anyone who was a solo practitioner, and it is possible to be a single practitioner of kink. But and all the people I spoke to were doing it with other people, one or more other people. And the uniqueness of the spacing state is that you're not in it on your own. Whereas samadhi and comparative states, enlightenment, is about you. And you get there, you might get there using teachings from somebody else, but you aren't traveling there with somebody else. You aren't pulling each other up the mountain step by step. Whereas when you space in a kink sense, I and most of my research participants would agree, you are co-creating that state. You're both contributing to it. You're both helping the other one to get there, and it wouldn't exist without the other person. So that, I think, is unique, or certainly unusual in altered states.
So this is it for today's video. What do you think about what we talked about? Let me know in the comment section. And if you did like this video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so that you will never miss a new upload from me. And as always, stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.